Top stories. Russian forces are reportedly getting closer to the Ukrainian capital, with the city's mayor saying Kiev has been transformed into a fortress. Divisions emerge among European Union leaders over Ukraine's appeal for quick accession to the bloc and the scope of sanctions against Russia. And Iran's foreign minister says a good and durable agreement on the revival of the JCPOA is within reach if the U.S. acts realistically and consistently. Those were the top stories of just past 1:30 p.m. over here in Tehran, and you're watching us live. This is Press TV. Key battleground developments on day 16 of the Russian offensive in Ukraine. Russia says it has launched a high-precision, long-range attack on two military airfields in the cities of Lutsk and Ivano-Frankivsk. Moscow says the airfields are now out of action. It says Russian forces have destroyed over 3,200 Ukrainian military installations since the beginning of the offensive. Russian troops are now edging closer to the capital, Kiev. The city's mayor says half of the population has fled, with Kiev being transformed into, quote, a fortress. Civilians continue to flee other cities as well. The Ukrainian government has accused Russia of bombing corridors meaning to evacuate the civilians. At least four major Ukrainian cities, I should say, are now encircled by Russian forces. They include Kharkiv in the east and Sumy in the northeast. Meanwhile, pro-Russian forces fighting for independence for years say they have captured Volnovakha. It's located north of the besieged city of Mariupol. Our correspondent Robert Carter joined us earlier to talk about the influx of Ukrainian refugees that have been fleeing to Poland. He says the country has received the largest share of refugees and will be facing a huge battle to shelter these people.
Well over 1 million people are now Ukrainians are inside Poland right now. So it's a huge uphill battle that Poland is facing to try and cater for all of these new guests. In fact, I have a statistic which suggests, it was published by the Wall Street Journal today, that up to 2 Ukrainian refugees are entering Poland every 3 seconds right now. So that's just how serious the situation is. Obviously, Poland is a country which traditionally doesn't like to take in refugees, as we've seen from their handling of African or Middle Eastern refugees in past crises. They preferred to keep them out, but on this occasion they've opened their doors and they're now trying to handle this influx of mass people, this mass movement that has occurred. So obviously the situation here, Poland is facing its own battle with the refugee situation, but the situation inside Ukraine is intensifying, and obviously reports are coming in thick and fast of continued fighting and bomb attacks and things like that. And obviously the capital, Kiev, it's a hot spot for that violence. And the more the violence inside Ukraine escalates, more refugees from other parts of the country start to look to leave. And of course, the majority of them are heading to Poland.
Tensions between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine take on new aspects, with the two sides now locked in a dispute over alleged biolabs in Ukraine. Russia has accused the U.S. of financing a Ukrainian biological program involving deadly pathogens for military purposes. Washington denies that, calling the accusation gaslighting. The U.S. says the Russian claim is in line with its false flag efforts that Washington has warned before. The government in Kiev has also denied any such program on Ukrainian soil. Now the UN Security Council is set to convene later on Friday to discuss the issue. A meeting will be held at the request of Russia. European Union leaders dismiss Ukraine's appeal for rapid accession to the bloc. Take a listen.
Er is request for candidate membership from Ukraine, and that is now in process, and we have fast-tracked the sending it on to the Commission earlier this week by the Council. That's one, but that will take time, months, maybe years before you get to anything.
Yeah. Except Eastern Germany in times of Helmut Kohl, nobody entered the European Union overnight.
Ukraine applied for fast EU membership shortly after Russia began its military operation there on February the 24th. Ukraine's neighbors on the EU's eastern flank back Kiev's rapid accession, but others like the Netherlands say for now what is important is that Ukraine has made the demand. On Thursday, EU leaders met in France to discuss further support to Ukraine in the face of the ongoing Russian offensive. They also discussed how to reduce their reliance on Russian energy. Already high fuel prices have soared in Europe in recent days in the wake of sanctions on Russian energy. The heads of the European Union have met in the suburbs of the French capital to discuss the ongoing crisis between Russia and Ukraine. In response to the crisis, Europe is considering sweeping changes which could create historic impacts, specifically on the continent's energy sector. Ramin Mazaheri is in Paris.
At the Palace of Versailles, famed as the seat of absolute autocracy and anti-democracy, the leaders of the European Union met in order to discuss possibly historic reversals of long-standing policies as a response to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
The challenge is to leave the summit with a firm declaration that a peak of new sanctions is reached, that they will be applied, and that everyone is ready to move towards the same decisions, such as freezing assets of both the Russian central bank and private banks, sanctions on those close to Europe, and reducing gas purchases.
Russia is the biggest supplier of fossil fuels to the European Union, and the meeting will discuss how to reduce as much as 2/3 of its natural gas needs from Russia within a year. That is expected to be extremely painful for businesses and households, and would force a reversal of green energy policies, which many European politicians have insisted were of apocalyptic importance for many years. One of the key arguments often used to defend the EU is that it is responsible for an era of European peace. But many say the two-day conference may provide the foundations for a new European army. For the first time, the EU has sent lethal weapons, even though the bloc won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. More than half of Europe has already sent arms to Ukraine, further escalating the conflict.
There needs to be a form of strategic autonomy, which Macron keeps repeating. And if not independence, then less dependence from both Washington and Moscow. The consequences of this conflict will be felt on Europe, so Europe needs to show unprecedented unity and swiftness.
To fund these changes, the leaders are discussing a potentially massive bond sale similar to the bloc's $2 trillion COVID rescue fund, and which they refused to do during the age of austerity. The latest round of Russia-Ukraine peace talks in Turkey failed to make any progress at all. The fallout from the conflict in the Ukraine is provoking massive shifts in historical developments, and with a rapidity that few imagined possible. If the two countries can't make peace soon, the world may look very different very quickly. Ramin Mazaheri, Press TV, Paris.
Let's move on to our other stories now. Negotiations to revive the 2015 landmark Iran deal are underway in Austria's capital. Now, Iran's foreign minister says a good and durable agreement is within reach if the United States acts realistically and consistently. In a tweet, Hossein Amir Abdullahian said no single party can determine the end result of the negotiations. He said a joint endeavor is needed to accomplish the Vienna talks. Earlier, the top diplomat rejected what he called U.S. excessive demands, saying they do not have a logical justification. The eighth round of negotiations are now underway in Vienna. Iran says a deal is possible if the West makes necessary decisions. A verifiable removal of sanctions and guarantees that the the U.S. does not leave the agreement again are Iran's key demands. It says the deal will not be possible if everything is not agreed upon. The U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the agreement back in 2018 and reimposed sanctions on Iran. Let's get an accurate account of those talks through the help of my good friend and my old colleague, Homa Lesgi, who joins us from right in front of Palais Coburg, where those negotiations are taking place in the heart of the Austrian capital. It's good to see you as always, Homa. Bring us up to date, please, with whatever you think needs to be said to our viewers at this time.
Arash, it's always good to see you too. As you said, these negotiations here are continuing in Palais Coburg, just behind me. Just minutes ago, we saw the head of Iran's delegation, Mr. Ali Bagheri Kani, exiting the hotel after another meeting with EU coordinator Enrique Mora. Now, Arash, we know that since Saturday, I think, the lead negotiators of the three European signatories of the JCPOA, Britain, France, Germany, have left for their capitals. Of course, continuing their contacts via phone conversations and following up the negotiations. It seems, as Iran has pointed out repeatedly over the past days, that what's basically stalling the talks at this stage is the demands that Iran has and the need for the Americans to make decisions and to go ahead with the successful conclusion of these talks, if indeed that is possible. Last night, we had some reports suggesting that there might be a short break yet again in these talks, and there might be a decision for everyone to go back to get more time to make more consultations, but we don't know if that is actually going to happen. It hasn't been confirmed yet, but we have to see if indeed that is what needs to be done. But I'll just add to the sticking points what we know up until this stage, especially from the phone conversation yesterday that Mr. Amir Abdullahian had with the EU foreign policy chief, Mr. Joseph Borrell, is that still it looks like the issue of economic guarantees that Iran is seeking from the Americans is among those issues that needs to be worked out. Some reports yesterday were suggesting that there are also disagreements when it comes to sequencing, which is what steps Iran needs to take when and what steps the Americans need to take when it comes to sanctions relief. But then sources close to the Iranian team rejected those reports, saying they are fake, saying that a lot of the reports that are coming out also about a final text being ready are also fake, and that they are part of a campaign to put pressure on the Iranian team. Up until this stage, Arash, we know that the Iranians say there is no final text yet. Russian Ambassador Mikhail Ulyanov said there isn't any final text yet. They still need time to work out the remaining issues. They are not many, we're hearing, but they are key. And again, on the Russian issue, I'd just like to also point out that Ambassador Ulyanov also made it clear that for the Russians, it's always been about expediting the process of these talks. The Russians do not want to create any delay, he said, or postponement by coming in with their demands when it comes to the assurances that they want, but that they also have to consider their own interests as the Iranians have to consider their own interests.
Understandably, many thanks. Our good correspondent, Homa Lesgi, in Vienna, who's been standing by for us for the past 15 minutes, I believe. Thank you very much, Homa. Like always, it was good to speak to you. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un orders the expansion and modernizing of a satellite launching station on the northwest coast. North Korean media say the order aims to ensure that various rockets could be launched to carry multi-purpose satellites, including a military reconnaissance one. In the meantime, neighboring South Korea and its ally, the United States, says the North recently used intercontinental ballistic missiles in two secretive launches. Seoul and Washington say the ICBM system used in those tests could be the largest ever Pyongyang has. The U.S. says the tests are a serious escalation that requires a united global response. Japan also says it's considering more sanctions against the North. Pyongyang is already under crippling international sanctions over its missile and nuclear weapons program. Political analyst Mr. Andrew Leong earlier told me the reasons behind Pyongyang's development of its missile and space program. He says One reason is that North Korea has learned from the Ukraine crisis the importance of self-reliance in terms of national security.
I think that learning from the Ukrainian crisis is very clear to the North Korean leadership. The self-reliance in terms of national security is the key. It's better to rely on yourself than promises of even partners or allies. And then this belief is has further been reinforced by North Koreans' experience in the so-called six-party talks and various other postures put forth by the United States, all ended up in nothing. And so it's not surprise that North Korea will continue to improve its nuclear as well as missile capabilities. And the latest is another example.
The U.S. Justice Department acknowledges that it will miss a deadline set by President Joe Biden to review and release documents from an FBI probe into the 9/11 attacks. The department says that's due to continuing coordination with a number of foreign governments and ongoing interagency review. Under an executive order by Biden, the Justice Department had 6 months to complete reviewing documents from the FBI investigation and make them public. Biden issued the order last September following a request by the families of the 9/11 victims to declassify the documents. Families have contended that the documents would show the Saudi government backed the 2001 attacks. They have already sued Riyadh, seeking billions of dollars. The kingdom denies any involvement. The attacks were carried out by 19 hijackers, including 15 Saudi nationals. They left almost 3,000 people dead. The U.S. Congress has approved a huge spending bill for this year. The package, worth $1.5 trillion, includes what's been called historic funding for Israel. The bill was passed on Thursday by the U.S. Senate a day after the House approved it. The bill should now go to President Joe Biden to be signed into law. American lawmakers have approved giving Israel $1 billion to help it replenish its Iron Dome missile system. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has hailed the move. He said the U.S. has shown what he described as overwhelming commitment to Israel's security. Pro-Israel lobbying group in the U.S., AIPAC, also praised Congress for what it called historic funding for Israel. March 11 marks the 10th anniversary of Kandahar massacre, on which a U.S. Army sergeant murdered 16 Afghan civilians and wounded 6 others, including children, in eastern Afghanistan. 10 years on, Afghanistan's public opinion is still seeking justice for the massacre. Here's a report from Kabul.
Back on March 11, 2012, a U.S. Army sergeant horrifically killed at least 16 civilians, including 9 children, and wounded 6 others in Panjwai district of Kandahar province. Today, Afghans recall the killings as shocking and inhuman, saying they can't forget about the U.S. war crimes in their country.
Around 10 years ago, a terrifying shooting was carried out on my relatives in the Zangawat village in Kandahar. It was like a nightmare. I can't forget it. American forces opened fire on civilians, including children and women. We did protests against the U.S. and didn't let them sweep it under the carpet. Americans should be held accountable for their war crimes in Afghanistan.
Syed Ishaq Gilani was a former Afghan MP. He led the Afghan team to investigate the Panjwai mass killing. He denies an individual act, saying it was planned and more Americans were involved.
Throughout our investigation, we found out that there was more than one shooter. We saw 20 footprints of the American forces at the scenes of crimes. The incident was shocking and tragic. It looked like a group of U.S. soldiers had done that. Then they blamed everything on one of their drunk teammates. The U.S. forces threatened the local people not to tell us the truth.
In a phone interview with Press TV, Sardar Muhammad, the lawyer of the victim's family, says that the U.S. Army threatened him and didn't let him pursue the file.
After the mass killing, the victim's family chose me as the lawyer. At the 2 rounds of trial, the American Sergeant Robert Bales was sentenced to death, and it was what the family wanted. But before going to the last trial, Americans threatened me because I was insisting on execution of the murderer. I don't know what happened in the last trial, as the Americans selected one of themselves as the lawyer of the victims' families instead of me.
After 20 years of invasion, the US and its allies hastily abandoned Afghanistan in mid-August last year, leaving Afghans with sad and heartbreaking memories. People in Afghanistan associate the US invasion of their country with destruction, night raids, and rights violation. They say the US should be held accountable for its war crimes in Afghanistan. Reporting for Press TV, Rahmatullah Baghban, Kabul.
Yemen's government has shed further light on the fuel shortage in the country caused by illegal seizure of the country's fuel ships by Saudi-led coalition. According to Yemeni officials, the shortage has impressed all aspects of civilian life in the war-torn country. Press TV's Abdul Latif Al-Washali is in Sana'a.
As Yemenis experienced the worst fuel shortage since the beginning of the Saudi-led war in 2015, Yemen's petroleum company held a press conference to highlight the impact of the Saudi piracy acts in the Red Sea.
In 2021, the Saudi-led coalition prevented entry of fuel needed to meet 95% of the general need for fuel. This shows that the Saudi-led coalition uses fuel as a pressure card amid the ongoing war. This is a clear violation of the international humanitarian law. The situation is dangerous, especially with the rise of oil prices internationally due to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict.
Officials say the purpose of the Saudi-led coalition seizure of fuel ships is to raise the price of fuel and spread chaos in the country.
The Saudi-led coalition is continuing its siege intending to raise fuel prices. They believe the rise in fuel prices will force people to go out to the streets and protest. But the Yemenis have proven to the Saudi-led coalition that they know who causes the fuel crisis, and they hold the United Nations responsible for its continued silence.
Besides the war, Saudi Arabia and its allies have imposed an all-out blockade on Yemen since March 2015. The United Nations describes Yemen as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but it has not taken any action to end the suffering of millions of Yemenis. Experts believe Saudi Arabia's recent measures to block Yemen's fuel imports are yet another proof that the Saudi military operation against Yemen is a failure. And they also say the Russia-Ukraine conflict has exposed the international community's double standard on humanitarian crisis. Reporting for Press TV, Abdul Latif Al-Washali, Sana'a.